Second part of perils of facial recognition. Before introducing our panelists and moving ahead, I just want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Ange Holmes, who isn't here right now, who's our coordinator, has to be at the front door because Ryerson decided that our buildings, which were always open until 10 o'clock, are going to lock the doors at 7 o'clock, which isn't very handy when you have public events. So she has to stand at the door to make sure they don't get locked until everyone gets in. I'm just thanking you, Ange, for... the format for tonight, before I describe the format, the center, as you probably know, holds about a dozen events of this sort each academic year. And as well, we have a film series. If any of you'd like to be on our email list, we don't drown you with emails, but you get a couple. If you'd like to be on the email list of just upcoming events, there are clipboards that Ange has here. We'll just pass around. All you have to do is put on your name and your email address if you would. If you would like to be on our list, just pass that around if you would. Thank you. And our website, if you want to know more about us, is up there, although I have bad news. A very nervous administrator came to see me about, and Ange, about 2 hours ago to say, well, I have terrible news for you. And I couldn't imagine what kind of terrible news he would have, other than to tell me that the Faculty of Communication Design's server had been hacked. And it was separate from the Ryerson server, and so they're taking down our website and others on that server until they can solve the problem so it doesn't get move on to the Ryerson server. So this is our website, but you won't be able to get on it. Oh, it's working now. Did they fix it? Okay, well, if you go on it the next day or so and it doesn't work, it's temporary, I hope. I'm a bit of a techno peasant, so I never know. I just want these things to work. I don't need to understand why they do. Our format tonight is I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to ask each of them a question to answer for you, and we're going to have a conversation amongst them, and then we'll bring the audience into the discussion. So if you have comments or questions, you can raise them, you can direct them to a particular panelist or to the whole panel. And all of our sessions are both live streamed and taped, and we put a video podcast of each of them up the day or so after them. So when you ask questions, Ange will give you a mic, and we'd ask you to use the microphone so that not only everyone can hear you here, but it will be recorded for the podcast. I'm quite impressed with the panel we have tonight. I'm pleased to introduce them to you. I'll do it in alphabetical order. The first is Brenda McPhail. Brenda is the Director of Privacy Technology and Surveillance, the Privacy Technology and Surveillance Project for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. She focuses, you want to come on up? Brenda focuses on advocacy and public education about privacy rights and the ways in which these rights are at risk in contemporary society. A project of that sort, I imagine, keeps you fairly busy, given the risks these days. This includes privacy in relation to national security, intelligence and public safety surveillance, privacy and information sharing practices and policies in the public and private sector, and privacy in the social context of existing and emerging technologies. Brenda received her PhD from the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information and holds a master's degree in Information Studies and in English. She's done important work on a number of issues related to our topic tonight. These include do-it-yourself approaches to privacy protection identification, privacy risks of RFID-enhanced driver's licenses, identity, performance, and government service interactions, Canadian e-passport developments, attitudes toward video surveillance, and privacy issues inherent in connected cars. So quite a wide range of issues that she's addressed. So join me in welcoming Brenda. Our second panelist is Kate Robertson. Kate is a criminal defense lawyer at Markson Law in Toronto and a research fellow for the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Kate's criminal defense practice includes both trial and appellate work, focusing on a range of criminal law cases, including white-collar crime and computer-based investigations in crime. Kate has acted as counsel in a number of leading cases concerning digital privacy and human rights at the Supreme Court of Canada on behalf of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the Criminal Lawyers Association, and the Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic, CIPIC, at the University of Ottawa. She previously acted as a Crown prosecutor in Ontario and as a law clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada. She holds a JD from the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law. So welcome, Kate. And finally, I'd like to introduce Laura Tribe. Laura not only is a member of the Center for Free Expression's advisory board, her day job is OpenMedia's executive director. She has a background in the intersection of human rights and information communication technologies. Laura loves the internet, she says, and is excited to keep fighting for what makes it great. We spend a lot of our time talking about what doesn't make it so great, so it'd be nice to recapture some of the dreams that many of us had at the beginning. Laura has been working with OpenMedia since 2015, previously leading the organization's campaigns and advocacy on digital privacy. Before working at OpenMedia, Laura's experience included working for the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, the International Freedom of Expression Exchange, and various tech startups. She has a BA in Media, Information and Technologies from Western University and an MA in Communications from Carleton. So welcome, Laura, and welcome to our panel. So now I want to put our panel to work. So Laura, I'd like to begin with you with maybe the simplest question. Can you tell us what facial recognition is and how it's being used today?
I like that that's the simplest question. I'm not a technologist. I'm not going to give you the super technical explanation of facial recognition. But
some of us will be grateful that you're not going to do that.
I couldn't do it if I tried. Facial recognition is what it sounds like. It's using technology to identify faces. It's from something as simple as Facebook recommending who it thinks your friends are, trying to tag them in photos, which is probably the most sort of user-friendly experience we see it integrated into. It's also the assessment of technology to analyze faces either in live video or in photographs or stills to try and identify who people are and match it against a database. So what that looks like in practice can be anything from Facebook, just saying like, this is a face and it looks like Jim. Is this your friend Jim? You're like, yes, this is Jim. Or it can range to things like law enforcement using it to analyze video after a crime has been committed. So going back and looking at CCTV and running images of someone who is at the scene against a database of people that they think might be suspects. You can see it kind of run the gamut all the way through to cases where malls are now using it. So Cadillac Fairview is an example where they're using it to try and identify people looking at ads. What is your reaction? Are you a woman? Are you a man? Do you look young? Do you look old? Trying to figure out how they can cater ads to people to make them match. So the range of ways that it's being used can run from the most banal of this is a face to I think this is this face, to actually being used in a number of places where it's live and being used by law enforcement to actually try and identify people, specifically with who they are. And I think maybe Brenda and Kate will get into it a bit more, but it's not that accurate and not that reliable.
Okay, thank you. Brenda, what are the benefits of facial recognition and for whom? And what are the risks and for whom?
This is a really tough question for me because it's hard for me to talk about the benefits, and it's easy for me to talk about the risks. But I'm going to use an example that I think will help me make both of those things concrete. And then I'm going to sort of leave it to you guys to decide whether or not you feel like the risks are proportionate to the benefits. So a really recent example is there's a grocery store chain that's owned by a Chinese company that has just announced that they're going to do a pilot to use facial recognition kiosks to let people pay for their groceries with their face. So using that concrete example, what are the benefits? Well, the argument is it's going to be really convenient for people. You don't have to carry that heavy purse. You don't have to take the 3 seconds, to tap your card on a payment payment pad. All you have to do is look at the screen, and the camera will compare your picture to their database of pictures. So the benefit is you don't need cash to pay for your potatoes. All you need to do is look at the camera. That's supposedly the benefit to you. What's the benefit to the store? Well, the store gets to connect who you are with an image of your face, which of course is a deeply personal piece of information, with information about how you pay for things, your payment cards, and whatever kinds of payment information that they either require or you voluntarily link to your face to make the system work. And then they get to link those things to your shopping habits, so the things that you buy, the things that you like to eat, the things that you pay extra for, basically all of your habits in the store. And they potentially get to link that also to any security footage they have, so should it turn out that they're concerned that when you use your face to pay for your groceries at the till, it looks like there weren't as many items as they thought the camera detected in your cart, they've got your image ready-made to hand over to either their security officer or a police officer, or even the person at the door to say, oh, better check her bags. I don't think she paid for everything. So the exchange there is you get a faster interaction at the till by a few seconds, and they get a plethora of information that they can use how they will. An additional risk is that here in Canada, and Kate's going to go into this a bit more, but we don't really have the sort of hard and fast rules that tell like a private sector actor how they would have to store your information, how they would have to keep it safe, and what purposes they could use it for beyond the purposes for which you shared it. So just this one little, and then the final risk is that there's been some conversation in the press about the fact that because this is a Chinese company, one of the wrinkles with a Chinese-owned company is that all Chinese businesses, by law, if they're domiciled in China, are required, should they be asked, to surrender all the information that they have for national security purposes. So as an organization that cares about human rights, and it seems like a potentially distant risk, but a potential risk is that people who have emigrated from China or come from China as refugees have the potential, by paying for their potatoes with their face, to end up identified in a Chinese government database. So that's sort of a small example that gives you a really big spectrum of the kind of risks that might come from what seems like a very simple facial recognition application.
Before we go on to Kate, just a follow-up question to what you were just describing about the obligation to turn over data. Is there still a requirement under the USA Patriot Act that any US linked corporation has to provide information to which it has access to American intelligence services that request it?
There is also that requirement, yes.
Yeah. So it's not just China, but also the United States. So if the grocery store is a store that's owned by an American company, or it's a Canadian subsidiary of an American company, then presumably they're obligated to provide it if they are requested. And I think under that model, they're prohibited from advising the individual whose data are requested of the fact of the request.
That's correct.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm drifting into the question I had for Kate is, can you talk a little bit about the legalities of facial recognition? For example, regarding the right to collect facial images, to store them, to use them, and what legal rights we as individuals in Canada have in relation to all of this?
Well, it's a good question, and I'm going to try my best to answer it in a way that doesn't make you regret asking me the question in the first place, because the Coles notes is it's a very complicated answer if I was going to answer it in full.
Take your time to answer it. I mean, you don't have to.
And I think that handily, there's a Coles Notes version to the answer as well, that chances are is if you haven't gotten an appropriate form of consent or a warrant, if you're a state agent or police officer, you're probably doing it illegally if you're involved in facial recognition, collection of analysis of images, or collecting information. And so the legality of the use of facial recognition really depends on who you are and how you're using the technology. If you're a company, you have to comply with privacy legislation in Canada that requires consent from individuals whose personal information is being collected. And so when you have a shopping mall just setting up shop with a facial recognition algorithm behind their video monitors, then that's a problem. Turning to the law enforcement dimension to this technology, there's a whole host of ways in which law enforcement can interact with facial recognition. And in Toronto, situated as we are here, a recent pilot project became publicly known that the Toronto Police Service was using, unbeknownst to the public, for some time. It wasn't until about a couple of years later, as I understand it, that became a publicly known or understood fact. What is known, as far as I understand, is that the Toronto Police Service had sought and obtained an opinion from the Crown about whether or not they needed to get judicial authorization to use the technology. And from what I'd seen reported in the media on behalf of TPS representatives, the advice seemed to be that if the police are scanning a crowd randomly with facial recognition technology involved, then you need to get a warrant. And I'm not going to, I think it's important not to assume that's exactly what the advice was. I've seen many people misquoted and misunderstood and not fairly paraphrased, but assuming that's what the advice was, I certainly agree that that would be a lawful requirement to get judicial authorization in that circumstance. But I also, thinking about the idea of a police officer setting up in a crowd to randomly scan individuals with facial recognition technology, I can't imagine why a judge would ever authorize that type of activity, essentially a fishing expedition. And I certainly think that there are circumstances in which a police officer who seeks to use that type of technology needs to be seeking judicial authorization, or much broader than that type of example. If that's what the advice that Toronto Police Service has been receiving, then that's a problem. And I think that there's going to be probably more to come on that front. But there's a number of ways in which a police service can use facial recognition technology, and the legality of it will vary, and what types of judicial authorizations need to be obtained. So you can imagine a police service could house within their own service the actual ability to process images with an in-house program that analyzes and algorithmically processes surveillance footage or photos. There's also, in BC, we know of an example where law enforcement actors in BC were sending requests to the public insurer ICBC because apparently they had a technology that the police didn't. And so they would just sort of send requests over, oh, I've got this photo. Can you run it through your computer system with facial recognition technology? The privacy commissioner in BC said that was illegal. I agree with that. You also can think about the legality of not just the use of the technology and the actual processing of the image, but collection practices in respect of surveillance footage, CCTV video, and photographs of individuals that law enforcement might engage in on a systematic level, with the potential that it may be used in facial recognition technology or processing. And then the legality of that collection of the images themselves is certainly in dispute when the appropriate warrants are not obtained. And so that's why I have a lot of trouble with the way that the Crown's advice was represented. Well, we can't go into a crowd and set up a camera equipped with facial recognition technology. That would be wrong. But we do know that the Toronto Police Service and potentially in Ontario, they're only expanding the use of police CCTV cameras. And so what is the difference between collecting the video footage for it to be potentially used later and then collecting the images at the same time that the facial recognition is being processed? I don't see a meaningful difference between those two things. And so that's an issue. And then the last example of facial recognition use would be a camera that's actually equipped with the technology, so that in real time, the device is monitoring, recording, processing, and identifying individuals in real time. And that's basically the 5-alarm fire of a privacy problem that I saw this week, apparently.
Does that technology exist?
It does exist, and apparently there was a report of the Manitoba Police Commission that recommended just this week that the Winnipeg Police Service equip downtown facilities with this type of program to address aggressive panhandling. And so a number of questions are rising in my mind from that. And so, the specific iterations of which laws would apply in each of those scenarios it's detailed, but as I said, the general principle is that when the privacy invasions are potentially so significant, you need regulation and limits on the use, permissible use, so that it's not misused for nefarious, unnecessary, disproportionate purposes. But you also need some form of confidence the public can have that the technology is not being used in that way. And that's why we usually require warrants. It's not to stymie law enforcement, but it's to allow law enforcement to satisfy necessary and proportionate objectives. And so that's sort of the long and the short of the legality.
But am I to understand that it's not clear that the kind of regulation and protections you were talking about necessarily exist now?
Well, in the private sector, the regulation does exist in the sense that privacy law does say that consent needs to be obtained from individuals.
Right.
And from the law enforcement perspective, there's a catch-all provision in the criminal code that applies where a novel police technique invades privacy or has the potential to invade privacy, and the other warrant provisions in the code weren't designed to capture that technology. It's a general warrant. I can certainly guess, based on what's publicly been going on and what has been represented to the public, that the police are not out there getting general warrants to use facial recognition, but that tool is there. Ideally, that type of opaqueness is certainly suboptimal, because it assumes that there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and it leaves it to the courts to work out the details on an ex post facto basis. And so the public is engaged in a democratic process, and so this isn't just about the legality of it, it's also about a democratic question as whether or not we want law enforcement engaged in this type of practice. And so having more clarity about the rules that are going to be followed, I think, is also an important part of the discussion.
I mean, as a person who's been known to go to demonstrations and for a number of years, I was always aware of the practice of what I assumed were police officers taking photographs of those of us at demos. Now, that went on long before there was facial recognition technology, but now can those collections of photos be subjected to the facial recognition, and does this provide a potential database of those of us who do these things?
There's a lot of gray about what types of police databases are currently in the possession of law enforcement services across Canada, in addition to the mugshot databases that we know exist. On the theory of the TPS, then that would be okay, as far as I understand it, but to my mind and understanding of the constitutional law in Canada, that would not be okay. A whole other host of questions does arise when there's images that have been collected in the past that are being repurposed for this new and potentially more invasive use. That has a recognizable effect under constitutional law that has to be addressed, and the law enforcement actors that try and engage in that activity have the responsibility to comply with those laws. So that's sort of the function creep that problem that exists in this area, is that there's a whole lot of videos and a whole lot of photos that exist in police investigative files. To what extent those are being migrated into visual databases of information that's never been identified in relation to a particular individual, that's a complete unknown.
Is this an issue that the CCLA has looked into?
Yes, is the short answer to that.
How about a little longer answer?
I mean, there's just layer upon layer upon layer of problems, and Kate has identified many of those layers. I'd poke at it, the legality issue, even a bit further. So it is true that in Canada we have a private sector law that says that there must be consent before personal information is captured, and that it can only be used for the purpose for which it's collected. But that consent model is profoundly broken as a general rule. And it's even more profoundly broken when it comes to video surveillance. And of course, facial recognition is technology that rides on the back of video surveillance. So we've done, back before I joined CCLA and I was at U of T, I worked with a professor who led a study where we went round to a bunch of different businesses in the city to try and find out whether they were compliant with the law that says that people must consent to having their image captured. So in the case of cameras, that's been interpreted as, at a minimum, they have to be notified before they enter the range of the camera that their image is about to be captured. In other words, it kind of boils down to, do they have a sign? And does the sign tell them that their image is going to be captured and why it's being captured, and who they could complain to or contact if they had questions about that? So some very, very basic pieces of information in a very basic tool. And there was
Well, didn't your
almost zero
professor
compliance.
offer a reward for
Yeah.
anyone who could find a single camera that complied with the law?
He did.
Did he ever have to pay out?
He has
money?
never paid that out. We did this research 5 or 6, 7 years ago? 8 years? Good Lord, time flies. Many years ago. And he still jokes about having that money burning a hole in his pocket. So, his name is Andrew Clement. Should you ever happen to find a surveillance camera with adequate notification, call
get
CCLA and
$100.
ask me about it, and I'll hand you over his email. He can pay out. He would be thrilled to do it. But the basic point around that story is that even in the case where we have a law that should theoretically on paper provide us some protection, in practice, it's not really super effective, even with basic video surveillance. And when you add the extra layer of privacy intrusiveness that comes from not just seeing you as you move through a store, but identifying you and then potentially connecting you behind the scenes to different kinds of information about you that have been collected from other sources, and doing all of this without you being able to see it, because of course what happens behind the camera is invisible to you, then the risks just sort of go into the stratosphere, and the regulatory structure that we have isn't dealing with that effectively. The other issue is that because often these kinds of technologies are used in contexts relating to security, both for private sector stores and obviously for policing, for state law enforcement, there's a culture of secrecy around what we do in the name of security. And it's claimed that that secrecy is necessary in order to protect the operational integrity of the security function. And there's a degree of truth to that, but when you're talking about hidden technologies that are potentially deeply invasive, We run across the societal problem where we're not even given the opportunity to have the necessary conversations that we should be having in a democracy about whether or not this technology fits with our values, whether or not there are places where we want to use it and places where we don't. None of those sort of fundamental questions can be discussed if it's happening behind the scenes in secret in the first place. So, and if it's happening in secret behind the scenes in the first place, like it was at Fairview Malls, behind the information kiosks, people don't know enough to complain either. If you don't, you can't complain about what you don't know. So when it came out that it was happening, it was by accident. Somebody made a mistake.
Describe a little more what it was happening at Fairview Malls.
So in the mall, there was facial recognition embedded in some of the information kiosks that was collecting, and they called it, it wasn't actually doing facial recognition, they said. It wasn't identifying individuals. What it was doing is facial analysis. So that kind of demographic sorting that Laura was talking about. Are you old or young? Are you male or female? Are you white or black or brown? Are you smiling when you look at the sign, or are you frowning? What would be your, what's your emotional reaction to their advertisements? Those sort of broad categories of demographic data. And the argument by the mall when they got caught, because it turned out that somebody left a monitor on and it became obvious that this software was running. And it wasn't supposed to be left on. I'm sure whoever did it got in big trouble. One of the things that they said in justification, first of all, well, we're not collecting personal information, so we don't think the law applies. We're not actually collecting the information, we're just using it because we're not storing it. We're just, recording the demographics in an aggregate database as you pass by. So technically, we're not collecting your information. We're just using the general information from the flow of humanity as they pass our sign. And these were both, I can see people kind of twitching as I say this. These were secret interpretations of the law that they developed to justify their practices and that were never tested by, say, for example, a privacy commissioner's office because they had decided for themselves that that the law didn't apply, so they didn't need to get an opinion. It wasn't until the story broke, that this was happening, that people had a chance to say, hey, that's a really technical interpretation of that particular provision, of that particular statute. Maybe that's not right. And then now the Privacy Commissioner of Alberta has been investigating this for some time, and I think many of us who watch these things are eagerly awaiting those results. It's taking a long time. But so the idea of hidden processes guided by hidden judgments or hidden interpretations of the laws that are supposed to protect us is another interesting wrinkle to the legality of these issues.
Laura, OpenMedia is running a campaign to raise concerns about facial recognition. Are these the kinds of issues that come up? Are there other issues that have come up that you're dealing with?
These are definitely some of the issues that come up. I think, it runs such a range of what facial recognition can be used for, and I think those are such great examples. And there's the legalities of it, is it technically collecting my data? What does consent look like? And then there's just what the world is that we want it to look like. And do we actually want this to be the law? So if that is the law and it's letting this happen, maybe we need to change the laws because they weren't written with facial recognition in mind. And I think a lot of these types of mass surveillance technologies are implemented before the laws can be analyzed or before the laws can catch up. And then once they're already in place, it gets so hard to rein them back. And so a lot of the things that we're working on is how do you make sure that, one, people know this is happening? If you're standing at a kiosk in a mall trying to find the store, do you really realize that your good day or bad day is being used to target ads towards you? Because to me, consent is knowing what's being not just done with my data, but how that's being fed back to me. But I think, the other issue that we're looking at is it's not accurate. Like, it's one thing to say, this is me, and this is exactly how it's going to be used. Facial recognition is notoriously inaccurate. It is very bad. In the United States, they ran I think Fight for the Future is a really great organization in the States doing a lot of work around facial recognition. They've actually run all of the representatives in the House in the States against a database of mugshots. And they had a lot of people come up as positive that were not, because they just looked like some other guy who happened to have been arrested for a DUI on this date or whatever else. It is notoriously bad. That's bad for white men. It is even worse for women, and it is even worse for people of color. And so when you look at how these mass surveillance tools are being used, well, who are they often used to target? They're not primarily used for white men, which is where they're the most accurate and still inaccurate. They're being used for marginalized communities. They're being used for people of color. They're being used for low-income housing. There's a case in New York where subsidized housing was trying to implement facial recognition as your ID to get into the building, to make sure that, only residents were allowed in because they were worried about troublemakers. Well, the people that are living in that subsidized housing complex are primarily people of color. It doesn't work on them, and all of a sudden you're locked out of your house because some technology that someone's implemented is being used against you, and you can't even get home. So it's not always nefarious, but the ways that it is used and the impact that it has on people can have really intense consequences. And that's just, can you get home? What are the things it's showing you at the mall? But then when you start to get into things about law enforcement and the idea of it being used on body cams, well, if you're theoretically in a case where you're having an interaction with a police officer who is wearing a body cam that is using facial recognition technology that mistakenly identifies you as someone else, you're now in a really dangerous situation if they think that you are a different person than you are, and you've never had the chance to engage with them to actually tell them otherwise. And so it feels scary because it can be. And it can also serve as a more secure lock than a password on your phone because your face is more unique than a 6-digit code. There's a lot of really good things when you talk about benefits that it can be used for, but it's like your fingerprint. And so I think when we're talking about campaigning on facial recognition, it feels like, it's the month of Blade Runner just passed and we're living in this dystopian future and all of these issues, but it's your fingerprint, it's your face. If someone hacks into your email, you can change your password. Your servers got hacked. You guys can take it down and reset it. If the database with your face in it gets stolen, you can't change your face. It's really hard to actually just change that. And so when you walk into a store, if they asked you for your fingerprint every single time you wanted to enter a mall or a store, you'd think they were nuts. But if they're taking your face without asking you, it's a totally different story. And so, when we talk about these issues, there's the legality of it, and then there's just, I don't want to live in that world where I'm being fingerprinted everywhere I go without my knowledge and I can't actually take it back. And so the campaigns that we're running and the work that we're trying to do is first to make sure people know what's happening, because if you don't know that the ads are being targeted at you until someone leaves a server running that displays the code on the screen, you can't stop it. But also the people that are charged with enforcing the laws and investigating the legalities of it also don't know what's happening because the companies and the law enforcement are not being forthcoming with it. And so the more we talk about it, the more they have to answer for what they're doing and say yes or no, or I refuse to say, which means I should keep asking questions, and it's probably yes, and helps us kind of push that forward so we can continue to make sure that we can live in the world that we actually want to live in.
Well, there's also a private sector use of this. I was just catching up on my email today, and there was an email from Glenn Greenwald with regard to his publication Intercept. And it was Amazon's ringed planned neighborhood watch list built on facial recognition. So Amazon has a surveillance camera division that sells a device called Ring that you can have, when somebody pushes the doorbell, it takes your picture. And it actually is now being developed, so it seems, into and I'm quoting, a seamless system whereby a Ring owner would be automatically alerted when an individual deemed suspicious was captured in the camera's frame. And these are linked in the neighborhood. So if somebody walks into your neighborhood and is captured by one of your neighbors' cameras, you're alerted. Furthermore, what their reporters discovered is that Amazon, in its Ring division, has forged, I'm quoting, partnerships with police departments throughout the United States, raising the possibility that the lists that are generated will be used by local authorities for other purposes. So just, you think you're making your house safer, you get Amazon's new Ring doorbell.
Well, so how many people here have ordered something off of Amazon? You don't have to admit it if you're. How many people have been worried that if it gets left on your doorstep, someone's going to walk away with it? Well, hasn't Amazon provided the solution for you? Because now you can watch who steals your package. And there are tapes that have been released of someone walking up to a door and picking up a package and walking away, and they have them on camera and it gets caught. Cool, your packages are safe. You can order all the new vacuums you want and they will land on your doorstep and you'll be fine. Until you realize that they're not actually being given out by Amazon. They're being handed out by your local police force. And isn't that convenient? In exchange for a free surveillance device you can have on your front door, they get access to the footage. And so Amazon has actually started integrating the Ring technology, not just with your neighborhood, but feeding it straight into different law enforcement agencies in the States. And so now, by virtue of you wanting to protect your package, which seems very reasonable to make sure that your new purchase is not stolen, you have helped build a surveillance network on your front door. And a lot of people said yes because they don't want their stuff stolen. And it seems like a really normal thing. And there's tons of security cameras and devices and packages that are now being sold that you can install at your front door. And if someone rings your doorbell, you can see them so that you don't have to answer it if they have a gun or whatever it might be that you're imagining is happening at your front door. But it's actually gotten to the point now where it seems like such a commonplace thing to say, yes, I want to make sure my packages aren't stolen, but it's actually so clearly used for facial recognition and integrated that the police are the ones handing it out. And people are taking these free devices the same way you take a smoke detector from the fire department and put it in your home, because you can see the use case, but so can they. And I think that's where Amazon has really quite deeply entrenched itself in that law enforcement environment before they admitted there was facial recognition being attached to it. And so that was this second layer that, again, when you don't know how the technologies are being used, you don't realize that there's this extra layer being applied to the devices until, for 3 months you've been filming your front door, and every car that drives by at the intersection, they've caught all kinds of interesting events on there. But it's definitely not with the consent of anyone coming up to your front door. But it's also not necessarily even with the consent of the homeowner, because they don't realize exactly what's being done with that data once they pass it on.
Go ahead.
To my mind, the reporting on the relationship between Amazon Ring and law enforcement is somewhat disturbing at times. And I think this is a bit of a sleeping giant in constitutional privacy law, at least in Canada, in the sense of the growing extent to which there are regularized, systematized data sharing practices between non-police actors and law enforcement agencies. And there's a very well-entrenched and uncontroversial rule in our constitutional law that if the police ask a non-police actor to do something for them for a law enforcement purpose, that non-police actor becomes and steps into the shoes of the police in terms of their obligations under the Constitution, including the requirement to get warrants. That has the extent to which that law has been applied in the past is very rare, because it's just not that often, but the courts have not been asked to look closely at something like a Ring partnership with law enforcement and the legality and constitutionality of that type of practice. But there's a whole number of developments in the Canadian big data marketplace and law reform in Canada that suggests that problem is definitely coming.
So if the police are giving out or encouraging you, or you can get a free doorbell that takes photos.
Don't take it.
No, I got that. But in a sense, then you're becoming an agent for the police.
Well,
insofar as your doorbell may be hooked into their
It depends on, the expectation and the request level and how much there's an expectation and a practice of data sharing back to law enforcement. Just giving out a device that's never fruitful to the police is not the problem. It's the data sharing back to law enforcement. So that's a recent case was in the Court of Appeal in this province that found that an energy provider was sharing data about energy usage in homes such that the energy provider itself became a police officer under the constitutional rules that apply. And so the ramifications of that type of extension of the Constitution into the big data market is just, I have a hard time wrapping my head around it, but I can't see any other way around that. Like if the police, for example, were to purchase data sets and tell the private sector that, well, we're in the market, we'd like to start buying data sets, and that's something that has been flagged in new national security legislation. I don't see how.
You might elaborate for everybody about what you mean by data sets.
So if there's a data set of information that malls, stores, et cetera, tech providers amass through the sort of creeping surveillance or commercial surveillance interactions that we really are starting to see so often that it becomes unthinking in a way, the phone's listening to what you're saying, that kind of thing. That type of commercial surveillance, I think many Canadians understand to be ongoing in a profit-oriented way, the economization of our personal data. But when it's purchased by the police for law enforcement purposes, it just creates this whole other dimension to the extent to which Facebook is watching what we're doing. And if they turn around and sell that data on a regular basis to the police, then the consequences would be significant.
Well, the last thing I'd like to do before bringing the audience into it is to ask you a little bit about what we can do about all this. I know you think about that a lot, Brenda. What?
Well, I was interested to hear Laura talk about the comparison to fingerprinting, because we've actually started at CCLA, when we talk about it, not talking about facial recognition, but facial fingerprinting, because it sort of brings home what the risks are. So that's one of the things we can do, which is talk about it, and talk about it in terms that are expressive of what's actually happening. Because we need to have the public conversations where we say, first of all, the fundamental question, why would we want this? Before we get into how, before we get into whether or not it works, and it doesn't, but the fact that it doesn't in some ways is okay, because if it worked perfectly, it would be worse. But before we get to how or whether it works, or in what situations there might be a possibly proportionate or necessary way in which we could implement it if we tried really hard to address all the risks, the very first and foremost question that we need to ask is why? Why do we want it? Why would we want it? And if we don't have a genuine, reasonable, non-spurious, non-commercial why, if we don't have a why that fits with our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and our constitutional values, including the human right to privacy and the ability to be a face in a crowd, then I think the answer is we need to agitate in public policy forums to say, if there's no reason, don't do it.
I mean, just following up on that a second, I mean, we don't think about it much, but one of our fundamental rights is to be anonymous in a public place. You know, so many people, when we raise these kinds of concerns, will respond by saying, well, you know, why are you worried if you have nothing to hide? But our notion of privacy and occasionally anonymity is essential to our being. It's essential to democracy. It's our ability to not be seen when we don't want to be seen.
Absolutely.
Is fundamental. And maybe, and I think in some ways this is the most worrisome aspect of these technologies, is it may be disappearing. I heard an interview, this was a BBC reporter who had gone into, I forget what city it was in China, where they were experimenting with widespread facial recognition. And as part of the, maybe one of you knows the story better than I, where the authorities wanted to demonstrate to him the effectiveness of their almost universal facial recognition technology within the city. So they gave this very experienced BBC reporter, they said, well, why don't you try to get lost in our city? You know, you're a very experienced investigative reporter, you know how to be anonymous when you want, and let's see how long it would take us to find you. And they gave him a half-hour start. He could go anywhere, do anything to make himself anonymous. It took 7 minutes. And I mean, that inability to be anonymous when you want to be is really quite frightening.
Absolutely. And it's not about having anything to hide. It's about what have you got to lose if you don't have that ability anymore.
Well, do any of you have a last comment before I bring the audience in?
I am so tired of hearing the argument that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. And like, we have talked about this for years.
Yes.
And I think the best and most crude example I can think of is everybody poops, but everybody likes the door on the bathroom. And that's just one of those things where you have nothing to hide, and you don't have anything to fear, but it's still private. And you still have a right to do things by yourself when you want to. But I think, to Brenda's point, a lot of the assumptions around the idea that you have nothing to hide assume that the data about you is accurate, which it's not. There are a lot of assumptions being made, whether it's, what it is that you're doing in the grocery store, why you're there, why you're shopping. Did you look angry when you looked at that ad because you didn't like the ad it served, or because like your stomach's upset, or because you just got bad news? There's a lot of assumptions that go into that data that are used to create data about you that may or may not be accurate, and that's all assuming they even know it's you. And I think the damage of inaccurate data is just as damaging or more than the revealing of your most sensitive data. And I think that's where it kind of comes back to, for me, like, I might not have anything to hide, although that's such a lie, and we all do. Everyone does. Everyone. If you don't think you do, I mean, you're all here, so you probably think you do. Or you're here to explain to all of us why facial recognition is great and we should all give up all our privacy. But I think beyond all of that, it just comes back to, like, what's the world we actually want to live in? And I want to live in a world where what I express is what I choose to express. What I do publicly is my choice, and not where everything is forced into the public sphere by someone else's decision. And I think that's what drives that sentence makes me just absolutely lose it. It's so frustrating for all of those reasons, where it really undercuts people's autonomy and individuality.
Well, I'd like to open it up to the audience. Do you have questions? We'll start with you. And Ange, will just put up your hand. Ange will keep track of who wants to speak and bring you a microphone. If you could just identify yourself and ask if it's directed to one person, who it's directed to, or otherwise to the panel.
Hello, my name is Allison, a student from University of Toronto. Thank you so much for this excellent discussion. My question is, our conversation surrounding privacy has centered a lot on the idea of consent. However, the concept of consent itself is problematic, I think, because the imbalance of power between individual and corporation and government. So individuals do not have as much choice as we imagine to be. So for example, if you have only one mall in your entire town and it has facial recognition, technically, you have the right to choose not to enter, but then how are you going to get your grocery and food and clothes? So individual is actually in the weaker side of the power balance in this structure. So how do we address this? Do we change the concept of consent? Do we change legislation? Do we change the fundamental way of how we think these things?
Who would like to respond first?
I'll give a short answer and then toss it to the lawyers who will give you the legal answer on consent. It's a great point. It's so true. And like anyone that's downloaded an app and actually read the terms of service and hit disagree.
How many people have read the terms of service when you click I agree?
I've read them on a terms of service for one app, but you can't, it's actually not possible to read all of them. They've done the math on what it is, and you would all be living millennia before you can actually get through them all. But if you hit disagree, it just closes the app, right? Like there's no way to say, I want to use this in a different way, which is exactly what you're saying. And like to say that I can't go into the grocery store because facial recognition is being used is not actually consent, I think, in the way that we would be asking for consent. Consent is saying, I am allowing you to record my face while I'm in the store, or I am going to shop without you recording my face. And the consent is whether you are actually able to integrate me into the system, because it's exactly that. You can say, don't go out in public where there are CCTV cameras recording you, except that if they're everywhere and there's not a path through this university that doesn't put you on camera, you don't actually have a choice. And so I think
coming up with the smart cities and what Google's Sidewalk Labs are proposing will mean massive surveillance that if you live there or have to work there, you have no choice.
Exactly. So I think like what the legal definition of consent is or isn't, I think I'll toss it over, but I think you're exactly right. Like that is not consent. That is being forced into something against your will, which is very different from actually being chosen for it. So.
Yeah, I think it's a great question and so important, because I think it's important to draw what we've been touching on is that the technology itself is unequal in its effects on individuals who are targeted. It's less reliable for women and racialized individuals, as you mentioned, Laura, and the activities that go into law enforcement surveillance are not equally dispersed and felt for everybody. And so racialized, indigenous, vulnerable groups, mental health communities are disproportionately the target of law enforcement activities. They're disproportionately represented in something like a mugshot database, which is essentially just a database of arrests. There's no correlation between being a mugshot database and having been found criminally guilty of any offense, and they're forcefully taken photographs. So even something as I think in a lot of coverage on this issue, you see this held up as somehow this uncontroversial use of facial recognition. Well, we got a report of a bank robbery, so we ran the footage through a mugshot database as if that's just completely natural and fine, and it's not. That's a forcefully obtained database of photos of individuals who've been systematically and disproportionately targeted on a community-based level. And the policies surrounding the maintenance even of those mugshot databases are completely and inappropriately in the discretionary policies of each and every police service, and it's not something that's regulated under law. So there's so many problems here, and the link between the equality aspects and implications of the technology is so important.
I mean, fundamentally, you've pointed out that there's a profound power asymmetry between citizens and residents and companies and law enforcement. That's sort of always been the case, but the more new tools and technologies increase that asymmetry, the greater a problem it is in a free and democratic society. So there's been lots of conversations among privacy experts for a long time about the fact that the concept of consent in the technological age is deeply flawed. And there are conversations about how we deal with that. So one way is to say, okay, it's not about consent, it's about necessary purposes. And this is the kind of provision that we have in our Municipal Freedom of Information and Privacy Act, which says not cities must get your consent to collect information about you, but a city can only collect information about you if it's necessary for the provision of an essential service provided by the city. So there's conversations in the privacy community about what would that look like? What would a necessary purpose provision look like in the context of some of these technologies? And there's pushback from the companies that want to use it, because the reality is, as we've discussed quite fulsomely tonight, it could be very hard to prove necessity of that kind of collection because it is just so disproportionately invasive. But in terms of a legal solution, that might be one of them that would be more protective and more conscious of the privacy imbalance between individuals and the state and the private sector.
Thank you.
Howard Goodman, I came in worried and I'm thoroughly depressed. So I'm not sure I thank you for that. But
Well, we don't want to depress you. We want to be able to do something.
yeah,
about
right.
this.
And so I have a few observations, and I'd like your comment about whether you think they're material to the problem we have. So one, the public in general has no idea what algorithms are. Like, it's just blank and fuzzy and nobody cares. We're driven by fear, and the news media is feeding that fear all the time. We hear about an attack in a school that injures a kid in Peoria, Illinois, and it makes the news repeatedly. So our fear of things are stoked. We're driven by convenience because that's who we are as humans. We're participating in it because I think, Brenda, you said, is this your friend Jim? The purpose of that question is not, is this your friend Jim? It is Facebook training its facial recognition database. It's machine learning. And since all these things, and there's lots of money involved, and it's really hard to enforce a distributed commercial implementation of anything. Bribery happens, and it's hard to stop, and it's clearly against the law. So the questions I have, given all those things against us, how is this ever possibly going to be an important voting issue? Because the way you're communicating it is not compelling. It's compelling to me, but it's not compelling. It's not simple, and it's not going to resonate. And so the courts may put in something, but the enforcement won't be there. But the political thing, I don't even see how you begin to communicate that this is a real problem, because all the factors that move towards the implementation of a significant facial recognition intrusion are profound, and none of the other side is easy to communicate. So that's where my depression comes from. So any ideas on how you'd possibly make this a marketing campaign that people would stand up and get excited about?
Howard, I'm glad you always ask simple questions.
To some extent, that's my job, so I'll take the first part of that one. People need to see themselves reflected in it. That's what gets people to vote. They need to actually understand how it impacts them. And I think it is hard to imagine a world where this is a voting issue. But listen, I do a lot of work on telecom, and this last election made cell phone affordability an election issue. And that seemed hard to believe, that we now have all the parties talking about it. Anything's possible. In the last election in 2015, Bill C-51 was one of the biggest issues around the Anti-Terrorism Act, and that is not an issue people were talking about until something actually was forced to a head. And so I think phase one is making sure people know what's happening, so that when something happens, they're pissed off enough to react. And I think that's how you make it a voting issue. So if we're talking about mass surveillance in the case of Bill C-51, you know, the Snowden documents had come out. We're looking at how much information is being shared with the US. We're looking at all these things going wrong. Doesn't really feel like us until all of a sudden we see this massive piece of legislation coming in that is drastically increasing the mass surveillance powers of our own state. And people were scared because they understood the context of the world that we're living in. I think when it comes to facial recognition, it may or may not be that malls are the issue, and I don't think they will be. I think it's going to be formalizing what the RCMP is doing with it is going to make it come to a head when that actually gets made public. Or looking at exactly how that's being used at borders in Canada and what that's doing for people coming and going. Something that's really big and impacts everyone and where they see themselves in it. And I think from here to there, it's our job, and thank you all for coming tonight, but it's our job to make sure people get what that looks like, so that when it happens, when there is a big decision to be made about it, that's when they care. And they will show up. And it may not just be facial recognition. Like, I think Bill C-51 had so many other things in it that were not just a specific piece of mass surveillance, but it was that thing I'm talking about earlier, which is, what is the world we want to live in? And if all of a sudden it feels like we're hitting that tipping point or that big change where all of a sudden it goes like, wait, that's too far, that's too much, that's where you'll see it. I mean, you look at what's happening in Hong Kong right now. Protesters are wearing masks of all types to try and hide themselves because this is being used against them. Well, we don't picture ourselves in that kind of protest state right now because that's not the world that we live in outside right now. But let me tell you, the next time a protest happens, how many people you're going to see wearing masks because they understand the technology that exists. So I think it's not an overnight thing, but none of the change is overnight on any of the things that we're trying to stop. It's a long process, and you just kind of see it flare up with something like a new piece of legislation or something big that kind of forces it to a head where all of a sudden that's the thing that the media is making you scared about, and that's the thing they're talking about, and it pivots its direction. I don't know if that's a fair... But.
Yeah, it's the tragic event that hits the news that makes people see the other side. And those are the things that we try and stop by making sure the laws are in place in the first place, but it sometimes doesn't happen. So it'll be the child who's shot by a police officer because he's misidentified as somebody who's been reported as armed and dangerous. It'll be that kind of, mistake, tragic mistake, that all of a sudden makes people think, that could have been my kid. That could have been my kid walking home from the library who was mistaken for a gang member with a gun and killed. And none of us want to see that happen, which is why we try and get out in front of it. But the reality is sometimes that's what it takes.
Okay.
Julie McLaughlin. It's interesting. I'm going to challenge you here a lot. I just finished my last class today, and I was teaching museum studies, and I brought up Paul Feyerabend's against method as a method of showing the students that perhaps some of the most profound challenges to our way of thinking take us to the point where we challenge every aspect of our culture, including the ways in which we argue with one another, including the ways in which we form our systems. So applying that approach, I'm going to say that I don't think any of the things you just mentioned, Brenda, would move anybody. I don't think that the death of a child would have any impact. We've seen it time and time again. It doesn't. People are not moved by anything that goes on, and our culture has created a system that uses technology in a way which shows that they have not only absorbed all of this technology, including recognition and lack of privacy, they've welcomed it to the point where we have gone way past that point. And not to make people more depressed, but I think that there is no way that any democratic debate will take place that will change this. So using Paul Feyerabend's approach, I would recommend that you consider the fact that everything you're doing in the legal area is useless, and that it would require revolutionary actions, which mean that you require people to hack systems and destroy them, and to create fundamental changes which amount to tearing down institutions, and tearing down systems, and tearing down institutions that support them. And that's what you're seeing going on in Hong Kong. That's what people are doing. And they're doing it because they have to. They have to do it. Because China will destroy its citizens. It will create an absolute monoculture. It's already happening. It's already there. So everything you've said today is all very nice, but it's useless. And it's too polite, and you're talking to very few people, and it's not going to work. What do you say to a challenge like that? I think you go outside of the law. Would you step aside? Would you fight it? Or would you join it? That's my question.
Geez, one easy question after another. Just coming forward. I shudder to think who's next.
We have a couple dissatisfied audience members with the quality of our advocacy on these issues. I respectfully must disagree that what has been going on for decades at the forefront of civil liberties advocacy in and outside of the courts has been useless. That's verifiably completely untrue. I think that your contrast between the Canadian landscape, both legal and otherwise, on digital privacy issues highlights how important our constitutional framework has been in Canada to make sure that we're not in a situation where we do fear at a visceral level and an individual level the implications of not having important privacy protections. So the fact that we're having even a conversation about how to ask individuals to relate to a feeling of being constantly surveilled by a repressive state is a testament to that we don't live in that type of society, and so that's a good problem to have. But I think that despite the fact that there's a tremendous momentum that is in the private sector and law enforcement sector with respect to surveillance mechanisms that do threaten privacy, at the same time, there's also a tremendous momentum building within the public at large on digital literacy, privacy literacy, and civil liberties literacy, also inside the courts, that has resulted in considerable gains. And so I think that everyone has to take their own approach as to what they think their best way forward is, and differently minded individuals can disagree, but I think that Canada is an excellent place to be in terms of being an interested and engaged citizen, because our government cares. I think there's a significant creep factor that artificial intelligence and facial recognition has that we can understand and resonate with, even if we don't understand what an algorithm is. So writing letters to politicians, I do not think is a waste of time. I think that citywide moratoriums are possible. It's just, these are requests that need to be asked of your politicians. And for me, I'll continue to work on the legal front.
Okay, who's next?
Thank you very much for the great panel. My name's Chris, and I'm a grad student at Waterloo, computer vision AI, but my work is on sort of looking at privacy and bias and fairness in facial recognition, so this is highly relevant. So I have a sort of a legal question. So we're talking about, like, if a law enforcement agency were to use a facial recognition piece of software, they would need sort of a reference image of an individual to be able to match it and then positively identify you. So we're saying that often they're using mugshot databases for this conventionally, but sort of my question is, like, on intergovernmental data transfer. So, like, everyone who has a driver's license, everyone who has a health card has their face linked to their identity in one branch of the government, one agency. So I'm curious as to whether, like, what's that relationship between our law enforcement agencies able to access that data, because then it just allows everyone to be identified, or sort of where do we stand with respect to that?
Mm-hmm. I think I would recommend to you, if you are interested in going deep on this question, the Information and Privacy Commissioner of BC, I alluded to their report on the ICBC example earlier on in the presentation, and they go in and analyze just under the privacy legislation that applies to law enforcement as well as ICBC as a non-law enforcement but governmental entity. They ultimately concluded that data sharing for a purpose that was not originally consented to, and ICBC collected the photo and held the photo for that non-law enforcement purpose. It couldn't be repurposed without the consent of the individuals in the database to comply with or adhere to requests from police. But that doesn't necessarily address the constitutional question, but I certainly think that under the Constitution, you'd also have to have an oversight mechanism respected, which would come in the form of a warrant from a judge.
Just a cautionary note on that one. So Ontario is currently involved in or just wrapped up a data strategy consultation. And one of the core foundational principles that they're consulting on is how Ontarians think that our government could get better economic use from the vast stores of data they have by facilitating sharing, both between government departments and between government and the private sector. So while we've got a certain degree of protection now, there's active conversations. I actually spent all day today at a meeting where people were talking about something called people beneficial data sharing. And the idea was, how can we facilitate data sharing that's not currently allowed if it's helpful for people? What's helpful for people? Well, what's helpful for people is if Canada's economy is stronger. So those are the kinds of conversations that are happening right now about the benefit of data sharing, buying into the hype of, yay, big data, innovation. And those are the kind of conversations that it's really important that people who understand the technology and are engaged with those issues weigh in on at a policy level. I think, just a little pitch, I know that the submissions on the discussion papers for that consultation closed on Friday, but the online consultation might still be open.
But I mean, you make an important point. There's a certain broadly based fascination with new bells and whistles and technologies and so forth. And we see a little bit of that with regard to, again, the example I used before of the Sidewalk Labs proposal for having these smart city provisions, all these things. And I just find politicians being very uncritical about what that might mean. And I think that happens with a lot of these technologies. I mean, a lot of people like me are sort of techno-peasants and don't really understand it. But gee, it sounds pretty amazing.
Technology
and
is
how we
cool.
demystify this and you know, interrogate it and look at the implications is so important.
Can I just add one more thing? Beyond the sort of which databases legally from intergovernmental are they allowed to access, in Bill C-59, which was the reform bill to Bill C-51, if you want to follow all the numbers that go through legislation, sort of the Liberals' reforms to the Conservatives' Anti-Terrorism Act, one of the big things that was introduced was the ability to collect publicly available information. The air quotes are intentional. It's really hard to define what publicly available means. So if you Google it, does that make it publicly available? If they have access to a Facebook page, does that make it publicly available? And so the biggest resources of data are actually scraping the internet for just what's out there and trying to patchwork it all together. And I think that's one that's another loophole that we are working on. Brenda has done a lot of work on talking about how do we define that and what are the pieces that we want to make sure they can't access without a warrant or that they don't automatically get because it technically exists on a server somewhere that's not my house. So that's another one down the road.
Okay.
I think you mentioned a few minutes ago that the police would have to obtain a warrant, and the threshold to obtain a warrant is not that high. So we're already floored on that front. Secondly, you made mention to protesters wearing masks. With regards to masks, under, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Bill C-51, it's illegal to wear masks in the public. Does that ring a bell?
I think that was that the Quebec bill? I think, or am I mixing it up with C-51?
It's not in C-51.
I think it was in the, I think Quebec introduced legislation after the Montreal school protests a few years ago. So I think that's where the legislation was introduced. So it's Quebec specific. I could be wrong. With regards to the warrant, I think, yes, we can talk about what the threshold should be. I would punt the threshold question to the lawyer. But the thing that I think is worth noting on the warrants is that the fact that they have to get a warrant means there's a paper record of what they've done. It gives us transparency into how often it's being done, where it's being done, why it's being done, in a way that I think right now there's actually, to what Kate brought up in the beginning, we don't know if they're actually being required to get warrants in all cases or if it's kind of after the fact being analyzed. So yeah, I don't know the specifics around the warrant piece is probably over to you, but.
Right, yeah, on the latter point, we understand that they're taking the position that warrants aren't required except in some circumstances which are undefined, and so we know that there's warrants not being obtained. I think it's a good point on the transparency aspect. I don't think that warrants are a theoretically low standard in practice. I do think that there's quite a bit of momentum that does build when a comprehensive information to obtain a warrant is put before a judge, and there's obviously a lot of cases where warrants have been found to be issued in unreasonable circumstances or information's been withheld that meant that the judge would have considered the decision differently if it had been properly provided, and so of course it's not a perfect system. I do think it raises an important point that really highlights the big picture question is whether or not we want to engage with this type of surveillance in the first place, because under international human rights law, there's more of a recognized requirement that to satisfy the privacy implications of state action, you also have to look at the proportionality of the measure. And that's part of our law, but it only creeps in every once in a while in the jurisprudence, and it's not a well-recognized or well-applied principle. But as we're getting into the territory of these potentially sweeping and invasive technologies, I think that that's going to be a next chapter in the jurisprudence as to whether or not the investigative technique has to be not only necessary and justified, but also proportionate to the objective. And whether or not the courts do that, or we do that democratically and say, well, you can only obtain these warrants under very extreme circumstances involving particular types of offenses. The government can craft a law in that way. This is a democratic conversation, not just a legal one. So I think it's a good question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dimitri. I found myself taking a picture of the panel just to keep a memento, and I felt bad about that afterwards, so I apologize.
Well, it's available up there in case your photo doesn't come across very well.
That is true. Anyway, thank you for the excellent public discourse. I appreciate it. My particular question surrounds the use of facial recognition at Pearson Airport. I've traveled through there very often for business and pleasure. I don't have a lot of details about it. Understand that it's necessary for law enforcement and terrorism and other things. My particular question is, are there any concerns from the panel on what's going on there? Are there any particular, does the government of Canada or the particular law enforcement agency, CSIS or CSC, are they subject to the same provisions of privacy legislation that, for example, other provincial governments would be subject to? And lastly, what are the retention policies there? So, for example, if they were to, if I'm at the airport and they see my face and there's no match, there's a negative hit, is that information or that match, for example, discarded or erased, or is it somehow saved in a data bank or in a particular data set and used in perpetuity? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Would like to go first on this.
Maybe I do a couple quick answers to the extent that I can, and then either of you can chime in. The short answer is that they're subject to different laws than law enforcement, different laws than non-law enforcement, government entities, and the straight answer is I don't specifically know about the retention policies that would apply. Generally speaking, what the law says the government needs to do to respect privacy is very contextual and context specific. That's redundant, but generally speaking, the expectation of privacy that the law will recognize in an airport is extremely low. And so if I was a strategic litigator, which I am at times with respect to, for example, the use of facial recognition technology, I will not be seeking to start a claim from an airport if you catch my drift. But certainly the purpose in which the technology is being used can be justified differently if it's not being used against someone in a criminal investigation, and so that's why the laws will apply differently and be justified on public interest and national security or public security terms. But obviously that does not mean it's a complete charter-free zone, and there's a whole lot of privacy protections that still do need to come into place when passengers are passing through the airport, and that would include retention of data and for what purpose. In the Snowden disclosures, for example, there was reports that were released about measures that were being tested to a certain degree of tracking and through metadata collection, and that would be used to track where the person was going after they left the airport through the Wi-Fi. So obviously it's important to ask questions and probe further, and yeah, I'll let either of you or...
I can't tell you what they're doing with the data because they don't tell anyone what they're doing with the data, let alone me, who talks in public a lot. But what I would say is, generally speaking, the more data they have, the more secure they think they can keep people. And so the likelihood, unless there is a legal precedent set where they have to, that they are deleting your face is actually very low, because most of the time what they're looking for are trends and patterns. And so the likelihood of them saying you're not in this database is actually probably not the main thing they're looking for. They're looking for who's here and who's here the next day and the next day and the next day, and actually trying to track trends and patterns. I am not in law enforcement, but that's just the trends that we've seen of the things over time. I think the other thing that's important to note about airports is like there are different types of facial recognition being used in different parts of the airport by different agencies. So there is a difference between like what it looks like at, let's say, airport security if you're trying to get through and what they're tracking there versus what they're tracking at passport control and where that's going. And those are actually different agencies operating in different parts of the airport. And so that's where the law gets extra tricky, because there's different laws that apply to different sections that are unmarked to you of the airport that are different agencies actually working. And so the kind of, as Brenda pointed out earlier, when it comes to national security, which is usually the thing that gets used to justify these technologies, it's also the reason they use to obscure any explanation of how they're being used, and airports are like high up on that list. So it's, in many cases, you don't have the opt-out, but you're also starting to see it show up in places like when you're going through customs, you can take the facial recognition version, or you can go see an agent. Which version do you want? And I think they're trending towards phasing out some of those options to force you into it. But for now, like that's kind of the choice you're limited to when you're going through it, from my recent experience flying through Pearson Airport.
Do you have anything you want to add, Brenda?
I feel like that's relatively well covered.
Okay. Okay. Next.
Hi, my name's Mihin. Thank you so much for such an engaging discussion, and I'm so happy you're all women up there. It's great. So when I was listening to you, all of you speak, my mind kept going back to like the use and misuse of like drone technology, and like how facial recognition often has highlighted the perils of militarized weapons overseas. And I know, Brenda, when you were introduced, he had spoken about how you had worked on like national security issues. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about like how Canada's government is using facial recognition, or if there's like, best practices or like learning that they've done by using it in like war zones or in conflict zones that's now being integrated into like more of like a micro law framework.
That's an amazing question, and it's one that I know absolutely nothing about, partially because that's a little bit outside of my expertise, but mostly because it's another one of those areas that in the realm of national security, you're not going to get that information. That information is not going to be public. When it will eventually come out is when some of the applications that were developed for military purposes eventually make it to the marketplace. And then at some point, you may actually even have a company saying, based on fantastic military technology, so good. So that's, long down the path of it having been developed and used potentially in foreign jurisdictions and for national security purposes, that we get a hint of what the development was when it hits the marketplace. So not a super satisfactory answer, but that's all I got.
Do either of you want to add anything?
They don't tell me anything about national security.
Really?
Yeah.
That's surprising. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
Hi there. My name's Matt, and I actually work on digital expression issues currently for IFEX, but I work on the policy side, not on the law side. So my question, I think, is arcade, and it's maybe quite a basic question of law, but I'm just wondering, what does it mean to say that most of the facial recognition that's happening in our society is illegal? Does it mean that if it's used as evidence, there's issues with it? Does it mean that people have some claim if they're recorded, or is it really purely nominal?
So a question about remedies, like what's the consequence of that illegality? That's a hard question. And I think that really speaks to what Brenda was picking up on in furtherance of the legal issues that I was raising, is that access to justice, if that's the term for it, is really not there in a lot of ways for privacy protection in Canada. Partly it's about the challenges and barriers that individuals will face in finding a forum or a process to bring a claim in. It's challenging to even know that you have been wrongly surveilled or illegally surveilled. There's a lot of momentum that is against litigation generally. But at the other end of it, the laws that do mandate remedies are, in my view, outdated, and particularly when you think about the consequences and the power that companies now have to be the deciding vote as to whether or not our privacy is respected or not. And so you've seen reform to privacy law in Europe that I think we can learn from in Canada. For example, privacy commissioners have fairly nominal powers to provide remedies to invasions of privacy. It's much more of an exercise in providing the public with information as a also laudable goal to that process, and they can bring offending companies to court if they chose to, but there's a lot of difficulty and resource limitations that they have as well. So in the criminal side, I can't, it would be a game of guessing to speculate as to which is worse. What is powerful is remedies that are available if evidence has been illegally obtained and the state is trying to use it against you. But once you're out of the hot water of criminal jeopardy, the remedies available for the other consequences that were felt and suffered in the process are very remote and difficult to obtain. So, at the end of many criminal processes, it's just a lose-lose situation, even if your innocence has been fully vindicated. And it's a problem. And that's partly because also police services are not systematically regulated with respect to certain types of data collection and retention practices. Even in Ontario, we just this year, it was a year ago now that they standardized how criminal record checks were being done and run by police services. It was just any police service made their own policy before that. And so when it comes to, for example, even asking them to remove your photo from the database, they can just say no sometimes if they point to some indicia of a policy that's not prescribed by law, if they feel that it's justified, even if you've been found completely innocent of the crime. So it's not a great answer. It's a bit amorphous, but I think it's a real problem.
Sorry, was there somebody else that's in line for a question? But is there anybody who hasn't had a chance to ask a question that would like to? Yeah, okay.
Hey, my name is Matthew. I just have a question, I guess, in terms of facial recognition compared to kind of all of the, surveillance, I guess, that we're already under. Because, if you have a Wi-Fi enabled device, if you have a Bluetooth enabled device, all of that data is already being gathered. I can use your MAC address to track you. There's plenty of open source intelligence that I can use to track you. And I guess with, the thing with that is that we do have somewhat of a choice, right? We could not use public Wi-Fi. We could, carry burner phones or whatever, right? There is some things that we could do in that sense. So I'm just wondering if you could maybe comment on, how facial recognition is worse or is different than all of the surveillance that we're already under. And maybe if there are any laws that govern, say, like the collection of MAC addresses or, the collection of, because I know that, for instance, there's, Bluetooth beacons in stores and they capture your your Bluetooth data. And so then if you, pay by, say, NFC, they know who you are now. So I'm just curious if there's any laws that govern that kind of data collection, and then how that would compare to, say, facial recognition.
It is layers upon layers of an onion of mass surveillance, and I don't know which is the worst layer of the onion, but facial recognition can be that layer. You said how you can surveil me. I now wonder if you're part of the surveillance state in the way you framed your question. I think the thing for me about facial recognition that is worse is if you picture when they used to do all of the, I can't remember the word for it all of a sudden, but the speeding cameras where they take pictures of your car going too fast and mail you your ticket in the mail. The photo radar, thank you. A lot of the reasons that were rejected is they can't prove that I was the one driving. So it was my car, but they don't know I'm driving. In the same way that they don't necessarily know that it's my phone or me, but they know it's my phone. And when it's your face, it's like fundamentally you. And I think there are problems to the fact that my phone can be tracked everywhere. And I think the idea that I can just opt out or carry a burner phone is like not the world I want to live in either. I should probably have a burner phone. But it's kind of that layered thing where like, yeah, this is the worst. Okay, sure. Also, our phones are being tracked. Also, and kind of goes down to some of the basic ideas of being photographed outside in general. But in terms of other cases, like some of the work that we've done with Citizen Lab and other organizations and CIPIC is work around IMSI catchers or stingrays, so like fake cell phone towers. And that's the same thing. It's a fake cell phone tower where you don't know you're under surveillance. They're tracking your communications. If they're reading your messages or listening to your calls, or they know exactly you're calling, that's really personal. Then doing it with your face on top of that. And so the technologies don't exist in a bubble. And that's the scariest part, is it's not like, oh, yesterday it was facial recognition technology, today they're wiretapping me, and tomorrow it's when they can start to combine all of those is where I think this side of the room gets really depressed. But that's the scary part for me as to why, in terms of like MAC addresses and what they can track in stores. I don't know what's legal or what's not, but those things scare me because it's not just them on their own.
Yeah, I think it's, to your point, the inherently personally identifying aspect of the technology means there's no illusion here that you're somehow de-anonymizing the data in the systemic use of that data and collection of images. And so there's no way to engage in the surveillance while holding out, well, none of this is personally referable to anyone, so it's privacy harm-free. But I think it's also that we've built a society on the understanding that images of faces in public spaces on the street are anonymous, unless you know the person. And so we just have already all of these cameras everywhere in society and laws that don't strictly limit the use of those cameras. Well, that's increasingly changing, but now all of a sudden the implications are totally different. And so there's sort of this aspect to which the toothpaste has already left the tube and we can't put it back in. So now what do we do with the fact that anyone can buy the technology to repurpose that data so drastically? And so ultimately, I think that's, it's a pick your poison question that I don't think there's a true answer to, but I think that's part of the nuances to it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what we gain by ranking mass surveillance technologies in terms of which one is worst and which one is better and performing that sort of calculus. I think it's more useful to say, for what purpose would we use any mass surveillance technology in a democratic rights-respecting society? If there are purposes, and only if we can agree that there are legitimate, reasonable, proportionate, and fair purposes, then we could engage in, well, so what kind of surveillance would be the most minimally intrusive? There's virtually no scenario in which facial recognition, which is tied so intimately to your physical identity, would be the most minimally invasive. means of surveillance. So if you want to rank them that way, that's one way to think about it, I think. And for me, the other thing is that so many of these technologies, and facial recognition is a really good example, are things that happen behind the scenes. And facial recognition is particularly pernicious because we have been acculturated for the past at least 2 decades to see a surveillance camera and go, oh, look at the security camera. Security is good. I like to be safe. It's deeply embedded in culture, and there's been forces that have been working to embed that perception for a long time. So then when you take a technology that changes that equation, that in some ways makes us less safe from state intrusion in our life, that's tied to a technology that we've been acculturated to believe is safe. For me, that's another reason why facial surveillance carries particular burdens that, despite the perniciousness of something like Bluetooth tracking of IMEI numbers, it doesn't have that same, I don't have quite the same level of concern about it. Maybe that's just a shortcoming in my vision, but I think that there's something to do with layering the technologies in way and building social acceptance over time that lends a particular urgency to the idea that we need to think about facial recognition in conjunction with the ubiquity of surveillance cameras and the wide-scale social acceptance of them, whether or not that's a correct acceptance or whether or not we'd like to dispute that it's a valid acceptance.
If I can riff on can your face be your undoing and ignore the subtitle for a second. Can you comment on the dangers, not necessarily of surveillance, but in terms of privacy and reputation of deepfake videos, which are pretty close to being reality now, where somebody takes your face and puts it on somebody else's body or creates it and makes it appear like you are doing something or saying something that you're not. Is that of concern to anybody? You're tying in the two technologies at all?
I have a lot of concerns about the internet and the way it's being used. I think looking at deepfake videos, and I mean, most people here have probably seen them, but there's some that are used of like, this is Barack Obama giving a speech that was actually by, someone else, or saying these ludicrous things you would never expect him to say, and isn't that funny, and look how powerful this technology is. It's really scary to think that we can't trust what we see in a world where we already don't trust what we see on the internet. And when your critical thinking can no longer apply because it's not a matter of, is this a reputable source, but it's now I'm seeing it and hearing it with my own eyes, I can't trust it, is very scary. I would also add that the last I saw, over 99% of deepfake videos on the internet are being used for revenge porn against women. And they're not actually being used for the political misinformation means that we were all worried that suddenly we're going to think that you couldn't use a deepfake video on Donald Trump and no, but that it would say something that you don't believe. And in some cases, that's actually the most likely scenario, is that something leaks of Donald Trump saying something and everyone now believes he said it because you can no longer predict what's real or not. That's what we're scared of, but it's not what it's actually being used for. What it's being used for is punishing women. And I think that's a different but equally scary version of the world to live in. I think when it comes to facial recognition, it's, they're related. It's technology that's really able to identify and manipulate people. But I think and Photoshop just released something this week I saw where they're actually working to build the AI that identifies Photoshopped images to basically fix the problem they created with Photoshop, where now we can tell what's been Photoshopped because Photoshop's going to tell you that it happened. And I think those are the pieces that are coming next, which is what are the misinformation identifying tools that can identify their own fingerprint on it. So Photoshop can identify Photoshop's fingerprint. Well, what are the deepfake tools that will identify the deepfake fingerprints on that to work through that narrative? So it's related. It's also just like a different scary part of the internet that we will have to deal with probably sooner than later. but so far is mostly being used very individualistically and punitively.
But also, I think what makes it particularly an issue is we've been acculturated over 80 years or 90 years to treat a visual representation as the ultimate proof. And now that's being taken away. And what are we left with? I mean, that's why it's hard to unacculturate ourselves from trusting a photograph or a video.
I think you can joke now, like, well, I read it on the internet, so it must be true. And I think it's just going to extend to, well, I saw it on the internet, it must be true. And that joke about realizing that not everything you read on the internet is true now applies to not everything you hear or see. And I mean, we're sitting in the school of journalism right now, but I think that ultimately comes back to making sure that the role of journalists are there, like that you have that idea of what needs to be reputable and you have that place you can go to know what's true and what's not, because it's not just someone videotaped something somewhere, so therefore it's true, but you need more verification mechanisms.
But now I may sound like Hooli in my response to what you just said. I mean, what we know in journalism is that jobs are going out the window faster than we can count them. I mean, we have towns like Guelph that no longer even have a newspaper. The OpenMedia news chain, I think amongst all the newspapers it owns across the country, has the equivalent of one old-fashioned newsroom. So I'm not sure the hope that journalism will rescue this is realistic. Not that journalists aren't absolutely committed to rescuing it, but most of them are unemployed. And so I did a lot of work in an earlier phase of my life in occupational health and safety. And one of the really powerful books that I remember was a book that had the title, Their Product is Doubt. And it looked at how the tobacco industry, how the chemical industry, how the food industry found academics who would raise questions about the link between smoking and cancer, or soft drinks and sugar and obesity. And it wasn't to prove that smoking didn't cause cancer, it was just to raise doubt about it. In the same way a lot of climate change deniers are saying, well, we don't know for sure. And that book was powerful because we had ways to verify it. Now, sort of all the ways we have to verify things are open. Social media amplifies doubt-creating messages. The ability to create deep-fake videos and fake images leaves us all sort of groundless. And in a world where there's a sea of doubt, and we don't know where we're standing, how does democracy survive? I think that's a really serious question. Because we have to make decisions based on some factual or accurate basis. And if we don't have any foundation for making those kinds of decisions, it raises such fundamental questions. And I mean, that's the worry I have with the issue you've raised.
I mean, I think that how to save journalism is probably your next panel, if you haven't already had it. But I think it's...
We've already had one on that. Nobody's come up with the answer yet. That's the problem.
Well, you might need round two. But I think the fact-checking in the world we live in is actually the thing we're struggling with, like what is true.
Yeah, but
and that's,
to be cynical, I pay attention to fact-checkers. And people who check with the New York Times fact-checker, the Washington... are the people who don't question this. I don't think the devotee of Fox News spends a lot of time worrying about fact-checkers or Trump's base. I mean, Trump has made very clear that, facts don't matter. You just look at the Republicans yesterday released a comment on a report that hadn't been released. And it was all false. And so this world that everybody's thrown into where everything's at play and, what that book, that seminal book that I was talking about Their Product is Doubt, you can really unsettle the ability to take action by just creating doubt. And we're in a world where so much is in doubt now that it's hard to know how to proceed. I'm not trying to increase your depression or endorse Hooli's But I think these are questions we're all wrestling with.
Well, and to yank it just a tiny bit back to facial recognition from that conversation, I was struck when you said, if we can't believe what we see, how do we negotiate reality? It's because what we see, the face that we see in front of us, has such powerful social meaning. So to link it back to facial recognition, is that social and physical and individual personal construct of the face the right thing that we should be using to experiment with relationships of power and deeper, identification of individuals in public spaces and experimenting with the ways in which individuals' relationships to the state and to the places where they live can or can't be changed by the activities, the surveillance activities that they are or aren't subject to as they move through their daily lives. So I think that the deepfake question, in an interesting way, profoundly illustrates the impact of face surveillance as a particular form of surveillance that has the potential for really deep cultural and societal impact that we're maybe not recognizing when we just talk about it as another mass surveillance technology. So your question was awesome because it just opened up a whole new line of thinking for me. Thank you.
Okay, is this the last question? Two more, okay?
Is this mic going down?
Yes, we can all hear you.
No, I know I can hear me, but it sounds like my voice is going down. Okay. Since on or about 9/11, someone said something, I have to paraphrase and use layman terms, something along the lines of seeing is believing and one has to fact check, which I respect. It's good to be critical and to have standards. However, a lot of facts and technology are hidden from the general public and the average Joe. And they're not considered common knowledge or technology until on or about 20 years later, i.e. year 2020, where now we're having meetings about how we can be tracked. I learned from my teachers when I was younger that a lot of these people come under the false nobility of safety. They come under the falsehood of safety. Sometimes the ones who, okay, I can't get off on a tangent, sorry about that. And it's my understanding that the TTC uses hidden cameras in their Presto machines. When you drop your $3.25 to get your ticket, there's a little hidden camera there, and the information that TTC shares with regards to your facial recognition, your pictures, is shared with the Canadian I think Border Agency, the Metro Police, RCMP, CSIS, just to name a few. We were not consulted with as a people. We were not consulted with as the taxpayers. And I don't think this is I believe we're in a dictatorship. We don't have democracy. We have hypocrisy. And I'm almost speechless. I'm kind of afraid of the future because a lot of the people, like you were saying earlier on, Ms. Brenda, they say something feeble-minded like, I have to paraphrase, may not be your exact words. Well, if we're not guilty, we have nothing to be afraid of, that type of thing. But until them or their children suffer or are draped up for something they did not do, I think that we're going to continue down the same route, like someone mentioned earlier on, unfortunately, where this is going to be considered the norm. And technology can be misused. That's about it.
Can anybody comment on the TTC business? I don't know anything about that.
I don't know the specific details. I know there has been an issue reported on, and I don't know to what extent I can confirm the scope of the problem, but I do think it is one of those examples where you can find a personal resonance because it's something that we experience in our day-to-day lives, and that type of breach of trust is disturbing, and it's not appropriate, and it also is legally relevant that that type of data sharing practice wasn't publicly known or regulated. But at the same time, I'm still two-minded about the problem in that I know that there are so many examples that we're bombarded with just how big the scope of the problem is in the 21st century of privacy, and how do we rein in, and can we ever rein in the misuse of power, whether it's private or public. But at the same time, I do think that there are concrete examples of that type of occurrence happening, and the public or the courts or the government responding appropriately. And so I do think it's important to vocalize discontent, and in a democracy included, but I'm not pessimistic that if something makes its way into courts, that there's going to be a lot said about what has been happening, if anything.
Okay, last question.
Thank you. I'm Danielle. You know, I think we kind of laugh about the fact that Andrew Clement still has the $100 in his back pocket waiting to find that one camera that's in compliance with the law. But we're used to that now, right? We just laugh about it. And I think there really is a strong point to be made that I'm not aware of any cases where private companies have been brought to court for failing to obey PIPEDA legislation. And if they have, what happened next? No one's really talked about that very much. When we talk about data-based sharing, you know, whether the TTC and the police or the RCMP or border security get access, we know there have been cases where, you know, they've been really sloppy about sharing information. It just kind of makes a flash in the pan, nothing really happens. What we don't know is, does it happen again? You know, I don't think we can comfort ourselves with saying that, oh, well, the courts have decided on this, because we don't know what happens next. We just really don't have that information. And I think that, you know, I don't believe in armed insurrection. It hasn't worked all that well in the past. But there really does have to be something done about the fact that people don't care. And I think, you know, Brenda, of course, you know, the answer to, you know, if you've got nothing to hide, why are you worried? The answer is always, why wear pants? You know, I mean, but people, you know, people will laugh at that, you know, or doesn't everybody, you know, close the bathroom door? Those, you know, those are kind of risible. But in reality, if we don't get people to realize that they're asking the wrong question, you know, the question is not what have you got to hide, it's why do they need to know? And I think you've made a really good point about that, all of you. They, you know, they need to prove to us, whoever they might be, whether it's, you know, the shopping mall or government bodies of various sorts, that there is a clear reason to be using technologies. Just because a technology exists doesn't mean you get to use it. Brenda may remember I asked her to speak on a program that's specifically for blind Canadians. And they were thrilled at the idea of facial recognition technology, because they said, do you mean I can have in my phone a database and then use my phone to scan a room and it'll tell me who's in the room? And they were absolutely delighted with this idea, because it solved a really clear and present problem. I don't think that's what our government bodies are thinking about when they're using these technologies. But sometimes these are technologies that are developed, for example, for people living with disabilities. And then people say, hey, what a great idea. We could also use it for X, Y, or Z. I think that what we need to do is start really making a loud noise about, tell me why. Let's, you know, don't even come near me unless you tell me why. And I want to thank you. I think you really gave us a lot to think about.
Any last comments on what Danielle had to say?
Agreed?
Great. Everybody's nodding.
+1. Tell us why.
Yep. Well, I want to thank all of you for coming, and I hope you'll join me in thanking the panel for what I think was a wonderful discussion.